But I do caution people about digging into their past, because you have to steel yourself to be able to do it and to be considerate towards yourself, I suppose. But I think I'm reasonably tough, but also I recognise that I've got a great store of stories that I can tell in a way which aren't going to be damaging to me, but maybe illuminating to other people. And so I'm determined to do it, and I will do it.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of I Know This Guy, the podcast where we dive deep into the lives of some of the most interesting people I know. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to I Know This Guy wherever you get your podcasts. By the way, my kids want me to say something about ringing a bell. What the hell's a bell?
So, Dad, who do we have lined up for the podcast?
All right. Do you remember Ian Thompson?
Yes, I do.
That was a fun interview. I really wish we could have talked more with him. But anyways, his referral was Colin Grant, who is a BBC producer. He's written a bunch of books. We're going to be talking about Homecoming and I, Natural Mystics. Two really great books. So can't wait to talk to him. All right. Welcome to the podcast, Colin.
Thank you very much for having me, Norm.
It's my pleasure. When Ian says that he knew an interesting guy, I take it for granted. It's the most interesting guy he knows. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you today.
No, well, he's a great guy, Ian Thompson, and we are brothers in arms.
It was really incredible talking to him last week. I tell you, that guy has got the driest sense of humor. I didn't know, like, are you serious? Or
yeah, he has a very strong, dry wit.
He does.
Yeah, great raconteur.
Yes. So anyway, I'm really interested to hear more about your backstory. So we always say, what makes Colin Colin? So would you mind going into some of your backstory?
Sure. So my parents are Jamaican, Ethelyn and Bageye. Bageye is his nickname. His real name was Clinton George. But he was called Bageye because he had permanent bags under his eyes. And they emigrated from Jamaica to the UK in 1959. And I was born in the UK. My parents had a very strong sense of the fact that they were British. Back in the day, there was no such thing as a Jamaican passport. So they came to Britain on the British passport, with the stamp in the passport right of abode. But when I was growing up in the 60s, I was born in 1961, when I was growing up in the 60s, if anybody asked me where I was from, I'd say I was British by birth, but Jamaican by will and inclination. And if my father heard me or overheard me, he'd say, "Stop talk tripe, you're born right here. You are English, I am British. Now let's get that straight. Don't let the man take you for a fool." So in honor of my parents, I fess up to being English and British. I was born in a town called Luton, which is a small town, perhaps 30 miles north of the capital, London. And I'm one of 7 children. I went to Catholic schools. My parents were Catholics. And in Luton, which is a migrant town and populated by Irish, Caribbean, South Asian people and English people, there was only one Catholic school that you could go to. You almost really had to be Irish to get in. So in the early 70s, my parents sent me to a fee-paying school in St. Albans, which is a cathedral town in Britain, again, not very far from the capital. And that school was called St. Columba's College. And it was run by North American monks. They were brothers of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And in a way, I owe my time here in front of you, Norm, both to the school and to my parents, because I think my parents recognized when I was growing up that I had what was called good brains. They were feeding me all the fish that they could get their hands on, but it wasn't going to work because I was destined for the failing state school because I couldn't get into the Catholic school because I wasn't Irish. So they saved up money to send me to this private school. But there was only one wage coming into the house, as they say. My father worked on the production line of Vauxhall Motors building cars. And one wage feeding 7 children wasn't going to be sufficient to send me to a private school. So I will say that actually I owe my education, and I hope you can include this, but I owe my education to marijuana. My father was a small-time ganja dealer, and he scrimped and saved and collected money from selling ganja in small sachets to his Caribbean friends who arrived from the Caribbean with their love of ganja intact. He thought he was providing a social service. As an 11-year-old boy, I was his bag man. We'd go around dropping off the ganja to his mates, and that was sufficient to send me to this rather expensive private school. I was always destined to become a medical student. When I was 10, in fact, my father sat me down and informed me that I was going to be a doctor. And so all through my childhood, that was the direction in which I traveled. And as you might guess, I didn't continue in that path because I'm here now as a writer. But for many, many years, I tried to live out the careless pleasure my parents took in me becoming a medical student, which I did in the early 80s, and before I saw the light and dug my way out of hospitals and I went into the world of broadcasting. But what's curious to me was that I never had any great interest in literature when I was a young boy, and that's partly because I was steered towards the sciences. I was going to be a doctor, and everything that I did had to be directed in that fashion. So in a way, I've departed from the path that was set out for me by my parents as a young boy. And I hope that they still don't feel too disheartened by the direction that I eventually took.
When did you feel that you were heading into the literary field? So you were going and you were studying the sciences. When did that change?
Well, when I was at medical school in 1981-82, the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel in the East End of London, at that time, every intake had about 100 students. And typically there'd be 90 blokes, 90 men and 10 young women. So the competition to get a girlfriend was fierce. And unless you were a rugby player or a sports star of some sort, you had very little chance. So I worked out that you had to have some sort of unique selling point. And there was a very beautiful young woman then, I'm sure she's still beautiful now, called Lucinda, who I had my eye on. And I thought, if I can write a play and see whether she'd be interested in auditioning for the play, we might have the beginnings of a relationship, even if it's only a platonic one. So I wrote a play and I auditioned various people for parts. Lucinda did audition, but she wasn't very good. And so I didn't cast her. But at that point, now I'm 19, 20 years old, and I got the bug. I got the bug of writing plays and being in plays and being in the environment of the theatre, which I found very, very stimulating. So that was my first interest in literature, came through wanting to write plays. And I, like many young writers, I looked at Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams, people like that, lots of English playwrights as well, Carol Churchill. And I began slowly to become more and more interested in literature generally. And when I was in my second year, I had a bit of a tough time. I didn't really enjoy medical school. In a way, I realized that I was in the wrong profession fairly early on. And every few months, I would have a audience with the dean, the head of the college, and he would advise me to stay, just stick and stay. It'll get better. Just stick around. You'll wait for obstetrics or wait for renal medicine. It'll be more interesting. But it never did. But in that time, there were, I'd say, 3 doctors who were very important to me and in a way nurtured my beginnings of an interest in writing. And they were a woman called Annie Burgess. Annie Burgess was an embryologist. She taught us embryology in our first year at medical school, and she was very theatrical. She would start her lessons something like this. The ovum is in one wing of the stage. The spermatozoa is in the other wing of the stage. Draw the curtains and let the fun begin. So I was very interested in her theatricality. And I kind of wrote a lot of my essays with her in mind as a possible audience in a way, or possible reader. And then we also had a woman who was a great surgeon who was called Rita Auden. And Rita Auden specialized in thyroidectomies, and that's the removing of the thyroid gland. And they're very long operations. They can take up to 4 or 5 hours. And as a medical student, you're tasked with just holding back the retractor, just holding back something to allow the surgeon to see what they're doing. It's a very tedious number of hours. And she said that every student who came in should come with a poem to help alleviate the boredom. And so she would encourage people to write their own poems. And because the operations were so long, you had to write long poems. So she got me started in poetry. I wrote some very tiresome poems. But then the most important person to me at that time, in maybe 82, 83, was a woman called Wendy Savage. And Wendy Savage was an obstetrician and gynecologist, but very unusual one. This was a time when most consultant obstetricians were men. There were only 6 obstetricians who were consultants at the hospital, and she was the only woman. And she recognized that we had no real understanding of reproduction or of women's desires, women's feelings, women's sense of themselves. And there's a book that most people get when they're studying anatomy. It's called Gray's Anatomy. It's a huge tome of 800 pages. And we would arrive at the lessons of Wendy Savage for our obstetrics and gynecology. And she would say, put away Gray's Anatomy. Here are the 2 books for you. Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch and Erica Young's Fear of Flying. And most students, most of the blokes, most of the men were rather bemused. But I read both books and was, again, drawn to this unknown world to me of literature. And I'd say those are the 3 women that really propelled my writing. And then lastly, what happened, Norma, was in, I think, again, 81, 82, I came across a book by John Berger. I don't know whether you know him. He's a fine writer. And he collaborated with a photographer called Jean Moore. And they did a photojournal, which was called A Fortunate Man. And what they did, John Berger and Jean Moore, they went to a place in England called the Forest of Dean. It's a very special place in the west of England, very rural place, very isolated place. And they found this general practitioner, GP, a general doctor, a country doctor, who they called John Casal. That wasn't his real name, but John Casal. They followed him round. And the book was called A Fortunate Man because he was fortunate. He was doing a job which was intellectually stimulating. He was very well financially rewarded. He lived in a lovely cottage, and his patients adored him. He would mend broken limbs of foresters. He would sit with the dying, and he would help women give birth. So he was like an ideal man in a way, and he's also a kind of doctor philosopher. And I was steadied in my determination to try to stick and stay in medicine through reading about this man, John Casal. And when I wavered the following year, through the book, there are various hints as to where this man was, where his practice was. So I worked out where he should be in the Forest of Dean. So I left my student accommodation in the East End of London, and I went in search of this man, John Casal, but I couldn't find him. And when I returned, I picked up a copy of the British Medical Journal, which is the premier journal for doctors in this country. And there was an obituary of John Casal, and it was clear that he had killed himself. And I had a moment there when I thought, wow, there was obviously a gulf between the expectation of what it was to be a doctor and the reality. And in a way, that story made my mind up for me that I wouldn't continue in medicine, and I would try my hand at writing plays. So I left medical school after 4 long years, actually, and joined a theatre company and wrote plays in my early 20s.
Wow. So that was the biggest effect when you found out that, what was his name again?
John Casal.
John Casal. So when he committed suicide,
I thought, yeah, this is a possible path that I would go down myself. Not that I felt suicidal, but I felt that I was going down a path that was a trap for me in terms of what it was that I thought I would get from a career as a doctor. There was this kind of romance about being a doctor. And as the child of a migrant, there were very determined ideas that parents like my parents had and their generation, equally the friends who were migrants had, and they were determined to send their children to become doctors or lawyers, teachers, that kind of thing. They had very sort of narrow ideas about what you could do in life. And so I didn't know anything other than that. And it was only when I started to read these other people that I realized that there's other possibilities for life beyond these narrow prism that I was seeing the world through.
It's interesting that you're talking about going through med school and that you were kind of forced into the sciences. I went through the same thing, not so much forced into science. I was going through film and radio at the time. This goes back, 25, 30 years. We're almost the same age. And it's not that I was forced, but like my dad didn't have a ton of money. We were okay. But fifth semester, I just decided this wasn't for me. And the guilt, just the absolute guilt that I had going, that 2.5 years that you've spent and you put me through school, that's not going to happen. And wow, it was just a tremendous guilt,
How did you deal with that guilt? Did you park it or did you process it?
You know what? I've always, I think I went into some form of depression. I think I did. And it was very hard too, because I didn't know, even though I quit, I didn't know. And that was the hardest because, quitting is tough. I don't like the word quit, but I knew it wasn't for me. And then trying to find something, it took years really to try to figure out what I wanted to do. And one thing I had in my mind, my dad had a factory. So I ended up working over there for a bit. I didn't want to work in the factory 9 to 5, and he was very tough on me. If anybody else was doing he had higher expectations for me, which wasn't a bad thing. Like he wasn't mean. He was, he laid down the law, and he's still living. And the guy is a true entrepreneur. He's great, but it was very hard. It took years because I hated doing a lot of what I was doing and getting into these jobs and not feeling secure. And that's the part of it is you don't feel secure. You don't feel comfortable in your own skin. And it, I don't know, probably took about 10, 15 years. And there was a heck of a lot of depression. I'm just one of these people that, you get into one job and it didn't work. Okay, depression. Then you go into another job and depression. I have become, I hate to say, I haven't become resilient against depression, but it takes a bit more to get me depressed now.
Well, you've exposed yourself to various pressures, haven't you? And you've dealt with them as a
absolutely. But I have seen, because people have been forced into doing things, into higher expectations, students. I know students that have killed themselves. I know my son knows a few people. I've known friends that have killed themselves, we call it losing their life to suicide, not committing suicide, but losing their life to suicide. And, it's because of these external forces that a lot of this happens. Instead of saying, one was a kid that was going through medical school and he lost his life to suicide. But all you had to do is just tell your parents, like, hey, look, I want you to be happy. I don't want you to go through and feel stressed out.
But that's a big thing to do, isn't it? I mean, I had trouble telling my parents. In a way, I kind of dropped hints for almost a year. And so finally, my mother turned to me after a year and said, "You've left medical school, haven't you?" So I did the kind of cowardly way and enabled them to see it and to tell me the truth. But in a way, I think, although I didn't like my time at medical school, I learned a lot and I was exposed to some interesting people who I ended up writing about, actually. One of the other people who kind of convinced me about the stupidity on my part to stay in medicine was a man I called Dalmar. I ended up writing about for a magazine here in the UK called Granta magazine. The story is called The Recall of Herman Harcourt. So one of the disciplines you do when you're at medical schools, you do some time in a psychiatric hospital. And as a student, you were tasked with looking after one patient. So I looked after this elderly man who seemed old to me then. He was younger than I am now. He was in his early 50s, but he was an old man. And he was a Caribbean man who'd been a scholar of some sort, but ended up on a wing of a locked ward of a psychiatric hospital. And he was an agoraphobic. So my job was just to walk with him, to get him back into the habit of being in society. So one day we'd walk for half a mile and then go back to the hospital. The next day, 3/4 of a mile. The next day, a mile. And we had these long discursive chats as we walked around the East End of London about the life lessons he'd possibly been able to impart to me. And I saw that actually, if I'd taken a wrong turn or two, I could equally have become that man. I was 21 or so at the time. And on one occasion, on one of these walks, we walked for several miles, and then he insisted that we stop off at his actual flat to collect some things before going back to the hospital. When we got to his flat, he suddenly turned, and it was clear that he was never going to go back to the hospital. He rifled under his mattress, as well as there being lots of dirty magazines there, pornographic magazines. There were several £1,000s, several $1,000s. And he then tried to persuade me not to take him back to the hospital, but to go with him to Heathrow Airport on our metro system, on our underground, because he reckoned that now that he'd been diagnosed as a man suffering from a psychiatric illness, there was never any chance for him to be defined in any other way. He was stuck. And the only way he could change the narrative for himself, he imagined, was to go back to Antigua, to the Caribbean. And would I come with him on this wonderful journey? And I was feeling a little bit fragile myself, and I was nervous about having to physically drag him back to the hospital. So I kind of indulged him. We went down onto the underground, this underground metro that we have in London. And there's a line called the Circle Line, which sort of circumnavigates London. And we went round and round 3 or 4 times on the Circle Line for several hours with him saying, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we almost there yet?" And eventually we got to the stop where the hospital was. And I persuaded him we were at Heathrow Airport. He ascended, realized I'd tricked him, but surrendered to the notion that actually there was no use in trying to escape the life that he presently had because he wasn't well. But I often thought to myself, what would have happened if I had gone with him to Heathrow Airport, if I had been mad enough to take him back to the Caribbean? So I was really touched, and I felt rather tender towards some of the people that I met at medical school. And again, almost in honor of my parents, so I'm glad that I was able to write about some of these people. And eventually I joined the British Broadcasting Corporation. And so the stigma of not completing this dream of being a medical student and doctor was somehow lessened by the fact that I was able, after a few years of leaving medical school, to join the BBC.
So your parents must have been very proud when you joined the BBC.
Kind of. Well, I should qualify that by saying my mother is the most important person to me. My father made various sacrifices to send me to a private school. My father should never have been a father. My father should probably never have been married. My father was a big gambler. And like most gamblers, he was addicted to losing. So we were estranged, actually, my father and I. Didn't see him for 30 odd years. And what was peculiar was that when I did start to write books, I thought I would actually write a book, which is a memoir about my time with my father, growing up in this place called Luton. So I grew up on a council estate, which in Canada, I'm not sure whether you have projects, but they're similar to the projects in the United States. These are social housing and quite poor accommodation for poor people, essentially. And I was going to achieve social mobilization and get out of that place and bring my peers, my siblings and my parents with me. That was the idea, I suppose. And I suppose I have achieved that because I would be wrong to say I'm still working class. I suppose I'm middle class now. But when I wrote this book, I wrote a book about that idea about achieving social mobilization through education, but living in this quite impoverished environment in Luton in the 70s. The book was called Bad Guy at the Wheel. So as I mentioned at the beginning, as I might have mentioned at the beginning, my father's nickname was Bad Guy because he had these bags under his eyes. It wasn't from lack of sleep. He suffered from a condition called subcutaneous edema, which he had from the age of 16. He was a merchant seaman, he was a galley boy, and some wag gave him that nickname. And what was kind of clear to me growing up in Luton amongst these Caribbean people in the 70s, I'm sure some of them found their way to Toronto, but what was kind of clear was that they were fantastic characters. This was a time when our family didn't have any television, and they were our entertainment. So Bad Guy had these bags under his eyes. Shine, like me, was bald. Pumpkinhead had a pumpkin-shaped head. Tidy Boots was very fussy about his footwear. Anxious was always very anxious. Clock had one arm longer than the other. And my all-time favorite was a man they called Summerwear. And when Summerwear came from Jamaica to England in the 1960s, he insisted on wearing light summer suits, tropical suits, no matter the weather, come rain or storm. And in the course of writing about this book, Bad Guy at the Wheel, I asked my mum whatever became of Summerwear, and she said, oh, well, within a few months he caught a chill and died. And so the book is a kind of bittersweet memorial of that time. And the book was called Bad Guy at the Wheel because he owned a car, because how embarrassing must it be to work on a production line making cars but not own a car. And back in the 70s, it wasn't very affordable for many people like my father to own a car. But this is a long story to point to the time then, 30 years after our estrangement, I decided I'm going to write this book. But the publishers recognized that my father is still alive, and they won't agree to publish the book unless he signs off on it. So he has to see the book. So I track him down after 32 years and bring that book with me, but also some other books that I've written, or rather bring that manuscript because it's not published yet. And I remember going to see this man and knocking on his door, and this very small man opened the door with his rather lovely lambent eyes, and he was smiling, and it was a real shock to me because I'd never seen him smile when I was growing up. And I never realized he was so small. I was about a foot taller than him because he was always a giant in my imagination. And what was curious was that he recognized that this was going to be a difficult meeting. So he had a friend with him, a kind of spar, we called them. And every so often he would turn to me and invite the spar, the friend, to join in on the conversation. And he'd say, me and this boy, so my father and me and this boy have a deep, deep connection, he'd say. But it was really odd because I didn't really feel that connection after 30 years. And as the meeting progressed, it was as if I was auditioning to be my father's son. It was a very curious position to be in. We had a reasonable time, and to get rid of some of the tension, we went and walked around Luton. And we ended up in a pub, a bar. There's a West Indian or Caribbean bar in Luton called the Cheshire Arms. We went there and sat down, was talking to my father, and it was clear that he was a bit of a character in that bar. And after a while, he stood up and he held up the manuscript, which had his photograph on it. And he announced to the people in the bar very proudly, oh, my son has written a book about me. So I was rather pleased to hear that. And then two young women came and sat with us in their early 20s. And they were Caribbean women, and we were having a fine old time. And eventually they got up to leave, and my father got up to leave with them. I said, what's going on here? He said, oh, don't worry, those are my bookies. You know, these bookies, these two young women whom he would go to this place where you can place a bet. One's called Corals, the other's called Ladbrokes. So he would go with them to place a bet every week. And after that meeting, the local newspaper heard about the rapprochement between my father and myself and decided that they would write a story. And they asked me what it was like to meet this man after 30 years. And I explained what I've just told you. But also I said that he was one for the ladies, and even though he's in his 80s, he still has an eye for them and they for him. And when that newspaper article came out, I rang him from where I live. I live on the coast of England, a place called Brighton. I rang him when he stood in Luton. And he was on the street when he answered on his mobile phone. I said, have you seen the story And he said, "How dare you write those things about me?" He was affronted by the fact that I'd written a memoir about him, but he wasn't really affronted by the fact that I talked about the fact that my education was funded by marijuana. He was affronted by the idea that there's a scene in the book where I talk about a friend of his who was a long-distance lorry driver and who'd fallen out of favor with him, my father, and to make amends and to curry favor and to come back to be his friend. My father's friend is driving down the motorway one day in his lorry, and he sees a field of sheep, and he kidnaps a sheep, and he brings it back to my father as a kind of peace offering. So, my father can butcher the sheep and we can have food for the winter. And just by chance, in the local newspaper that day when I'm having the story about the 30-year rupture that's been healed, just by chance, there's a story about space of people stealing rare breeds of rams in and around Luton. And the headline was "Would you believe it? EWE." And my father sees this headline, which is not related to him. And he sees the little story that is going to be about him. And he puts the two together. And he's ashamed because he berates me, he says, because I'm telling the whole world that he is a sheep rustler. And he's much more ashamed about that than he is about the fact that he's been this small-time marijuana drug dealer. So we had this difficult moment where he wasn't going to give me license to print the book. And when I heard that this was going to be a difficult moment for me, I encouraged my sister to come with me to convince him otherwise. And she came. My sister's a lawyer. And my father started to go off on one, saying that he was going to sue me and it was libel and slander. And my sister just reminded him about all of the terrible things that he had done that I had not included in the book, because the book is not a revenge book. The book, if anything, is kind of bittersweet comedy. And she outlined and enumerated them. And she said that if it were to go to court, you were to sue your son, Colin, the judge would ask, well, is anything that Colin is saying true, or is it false? And you, bad guy, will say it's a pack of lies, but Colin's siblings, all of them, and Colin's mother would say not only is it true, but Colin's diluted it. He's watered it down. He's made you human. And when you're not human, my mother's nickname for my father was Satan. I'm not in the mood for you today, Satan, she would say. And at that point, my father backed away and he said, oh, I wouldn't want to do anything to damage the book. So he came round to the idea. But actually, Norm, I'm sure you'll understand this. There are very few of us on this planet who are going to have a book written about them. So in a way, I think he was rather flattered by the fact that even though there might be one or two critiques of him, he was still going to be, paid attention. And in fact, one of the people that you've interviewed recently, Ian Thompson, wrote a review of that book, and he said it was an act of filial devotion. So there you are, bad guy at the wheel. Is an honour to my father, who was a bit of a rogue, but only did what he could do according to his particular skill set and the experiences that had shaped him. And I'm sure that's true of everybody. We can only do what we can according to our abilities and our experiences. And most people, even if they have failed as a father or failed as a husband, they're still a candidate for compassion.
How coincidental is that other article appearing in the newspaper the same time you're putting out your book? I mean, I don't know the odds of that.
No, me neither.
That's crazy. And oh man, so
it was meant to happen, wasn't it? I suppose. I mean, it forced the conversation, and maybe we would not have had that transgression not happened in that newspaper on the front page that day.
So what ended up happening when your sister came and talked to your dad? You talked to your dad. Did everything get resolved? And
yeah, I think so, because I think, Norm, what happens to people who don't understand the world of publishing, they assume that if you publish a book, you're the equivalent to J.K. Rowling and you're loads of money. And so, in fact, he had, I think, some friends who were whispering in his ear, man, your son's skank you. What's your cut? Where's your percentage? You're providing the content and you're not being rewarded. And when I was able to praise my father, the fact that I wrote books that didn't make money, I wrote books that they may find a readership, but they're not going to make any money. and I would give him 10% of my royalties. My royalties that year were probably $1,000. Then he backed off and recognized that, this is not a project that I was indulging in to make money. It's just a project I was indulging in to portray this very interesting man and his wife and my siblings, but also to fill the void, because I think often in migrant cultures, they get left behind. They are marginalized. They're not part of the mainstream. And so when I was growing up, there was this vacuum in the culture where the lives of people like my parents weren't being written anywhere. So I felt it a kind of responsibility in a way. And I think my father understood that in the end, to complicate the narrative, to include these marginal people and have them present in the center of the culture. So the book was published. And in fact, my father died a couple of years ago. And this is kind of an interesting moment to reflect on, Norm, because when it came to the publication of the book, there were still other people who were alive. And the publishers were nervous. And so I remember the day my editor, just before the publication, he got out a sheet of paper and drew a line down the middle and said, right, who are the danger people and who are the safe people? The safe people are dead because you can't libel the dead. And the danger people are the people who are still alive who may take umbrage. So we changed the names of all the people who were alive, apart from Bad Guy. But when my father died, when Bad Guy died 5 years ago now, I went to the funeral and I gave a reading from the book, Bad Guy at the Wheel. And after the ceremony, every single person who'd been in the book came up to me and said, "Whoa, why did you change our name?" They wanted to be in the book. They were fooled by the idea that they were going to have a footprint in the sand to show their children and their children's children. And they recognized that I had written with humor. And I needn't have taken that precaution. I could have named them, actually. But I was very pleased that they saw themselves and they saw that this was an addition to the culture that would enlarge the culture, maybe would revive the culture, and to see that people like me who write these kinds of books are not writing ethnic books. They're just writing stories that are part of the culture. So the book was published. And in fact, my next book, so I'm on book number 6 now. Mm-hmm. My next book is going to be a follow-up to that book. That book, Bag Out the Wheel, was just 1 year when I'm going to go to this private school in 1972. And the next book is going to be a hybrid book, but it's going to encompass what happened to me when I left school and started medical school and ended up becoming a BBC journalist. And it's going to be bookended by a letter that I'm going to write to my dead father and a letter that I will write to my children to give them some idea about what they might expect from life if they were to pay attention to what kind of life I've led. And in a way, I've kind of borrowed from Ta-Nehisi Coates and people like James Baldwin who've done similar things in the past.
Well, I want to just go back for a second and talk about your experiences when you were selling ganja with your dad. Did you have any crazy experiences, or was everything pretty straightforward?
No, it was all crazy. It was all crazy. And what was really weird was just the mechanics of it. So my father would get this big stash of ganja, come into the house, and he'd store it in the airing cupboard where it was warm. And there'd be a set of scales there. He'd weigh out the little, like beach and powder sachets. It's not very big. In paper, and made these little packets. He put them into my little briefcase, my schoolboy's briefcase, and I was his bagman, and he eventually gets a car, and we would go and drop the ganja off. And as I said, he was providing a social service. That's the way he saw it. Didn't think of himself as a criminal. But there was a moment when I think he wanted to cement the kind of father-son relationship, because I was always the one that was chosen to drive with him whenever we went to get the stuff from his retailer, shall we say. And so one day he went to get the stuff, and then he was going to allow me to go with him to the woods to hide it, because he didn't bring it into the house immediately. There'd always be a lag. So we went and we'd hide the ganja, the stash of ganja, in the woods with a little trowel. He asked me to choose the place where we would dig the hole behind some bushes and we'd bury the ganja. So I was kind of pleased and proud that my father was allowing me to do this. And then about a week later, we went back to dig up the ganja, and there was no ganja there. It was gone. It was missing. And my father was in a foul mood. And I remember the terrible day going to the house, and he rifled through all the drawers looking for the house money, the money that he would give my mother every week to keep the house going and to keep the children alive. And she always knew that there would come this moment. She would even hide the money in the lining of her coat, but he knew it was there. He'd rip up the coat and take the money, and we'd all cry. Then about a week later, a van load of policemen arrived outside our door, and they barreled through the front door and they raided the house. I should back up a little bit. Between losing the ganja and the police arriving just over a week, every day I went back and forth looking for the ganja. I couldn't believe that I was responsible for having lost it. And I was bereft. But then one day, on the 6th day of going back to this place where we buried it, miraculously, there was the ganja. I found it, and I brought it back to the house. And my father was at work, came back. I still hadn't told him. And that morning, when I'm going to tell him, is the morning when the police arrive. About a dozen policemen arrive in this big van, and they rifle through the house. They've been tipped off, haven't they? Because what they'd done, they'd found the ganja in the woods, and they were looking to see who was going to pick it up. And then they followed that person, i.e. me, to the house. And so the house had raided, and there's this kind of comedy. We're all kind of passing the stash of ganja between ourselves, our brothers and sisters, passing it around. And eventually my sister hides it up her skirt, and it's all terrible. And this is going on for about half an hour. My father's woken up by now, and he's embarrassed because he's a man who has this notion of the importance of respect. And he tells the police just to hold fire. He marches us all into the back room, and he says okay, who's got it? Who's got the ganja? He takes it from my sister, and he surrenders himself and the ganja to the police, and he gets arrested, and he goes to trial. But miraculously, when it came to the trial, he didn't get sent to prison. He got a huge fine. He got a choice. He could pay this huge fine. I can't remember how much it was now, but it's a lot of money. It's probably the sort of money you'd have to pay down to buy a house. Or you go to jail. And all of his Caribbean friends, they clubbed together because I think they recognized that he'd taken the risk on their behalf. And they found the fine. He was spared jail. But that moment was a real turning point in my parents' relationship, because the other peculiarity is that my mother was back in Jamaica, my mother was the daughter of a policeman. And so she had a high regard for the police and for authority. And then here was this big moment of disgrace. She must have known what my father was doing, obviously, but somehow she managed to put that to one side and not to reflect on it too much. But I think she was embarrassed, and that led to the separation between my parents. And in a way, when I was a young man, I often berated myself. I thought I'd caused the split, and if I hadn't brought the ganja back into the house, things might have turned out differently. They probably wouldn't have turned out differently. I mean, there would have been another occasion where he would have been
right.
back, I'm sure. But for many years, you talked about guilt earlier, Norm, but for many years I felt guilty for having brought upon our household this great firestorm of opprobrium and the law and ridicule and disgrace.
Wow. Yeah, that's something you don't want to be burdened with.
No. Yeah, no, I've let it go now, by the way. I've forgiven myself. Well, I'm very lucky. I'm very lucky in life generally, but I'm very lucky also to have this wonderful wife who is a hypnotherapist. And she has enabled me, through her own kindness and skill, to recognize that the adult Colin must forgive the child Colin, and to recognize that the child Colin was not responsible for his father's actions.
I wonder what else she's done to you when you were under.
What is very good actually, because recently she's called Jo Alderson, my wife, and recently I do some teaching now. Some creative writing teaching for an organization called Avon here in the UK. And during this COVID period, Jo and I have been doing some teaching together. So we were helping writers who are stuck with writer's block. And so we would do a double act. I would help them with the mechanics of writing, and she would help them with her guided meditations in the morning and some one-to-one therapy to uncover what it is that is really stopping them from doing their work. because people can write, but it's up here that the problem resides. And so she's been able to help me in that regard as well, but also help me retrieve memories which I thought were lost and could never be recovered. So that's been very useful to me, actually.
Now, I wasn't planning on going down this path, but you're just talking about these memories. Sometimes you don't want to remember things. By going under and by working with your wife, has that triggered anything?
No, I think it's a very important point because sometimes it can be traumatic for people. But for me, I found the process to be really, really fascinating. And I recognize that actually, even though our life may have been hard as a child and young adult, it was very rich in terms of the connection between my mother and me and my mother and my siblings. And in a way, if it has triggered, it's triggered this idea that my parents were both candidates for compassion because, like a lot of migrants, they came to the country with a skeleton plan of what they would do. And I think the idea was always to go back. So, but the idea is that you come and in Jamaica, you say you work some money, which means you work and prosper. But the 5 years becomes 10, the 10 becomes 15. And one day we woke up and saw our parents changing the wallpaper rather. They did change the newspaper occasionally, but they changed the wallpaper. And then we knew we were here to stay. But I do caution people about digging into their past because you have to steel yourself to be able to do it and to be considerate towards yourself, I suppose. But I think I'm reasonably tough, but also I recognize that I've got a great store of stories that I can tell in a way which aren't going to be damaging to me, but maybe illuminating to other people. And so I'm determined to do it, and I will do it. But I recognize your point that triggers can be traumatizing. I was watching and reading, actually, two things. I was watching a series by James McBride. Do you know him? He's a wonderful North American, African-American writer. The Good Lord Bird, it's called. And it's a story about John Brown, the great abolitionist who led the raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. And sometimes I am traumatized by revisiting the stories of slavery. And recently there's been this development, I'm sure it's happened all over the world, especially in Wales where the British had colonies. These monuments or statues that signify imperial prowess, but also signify the brutality of one group of people on another, can elicit trauma. So, I'm sure you've been aware of these statues being dragged down, these statues of people like Edward Colston here in the UK, the slave owner, the slave trader. And sometimes I can't, I've read a lot of slave narratives, but I don't really want to read them anymore. And I remember having a chat recently about post-traumatic slavery syndrome, which is this idea that trauma sometimes comes through you through several generations in a way that you can inherit genes. You can inherit a phenotype. You can also inherit memes. So I think you can also inherit trauma. So I think it's important to pay attention to the possibility that you may visit trauma upon you by writing about it. But I think there's a way of processing that through the writing.
I've never heard of that before. That's very interesting, especially with everything that's going on right now. But inherited trauma. I love history. I love reading about history. One of the things that I thought was absolutely fascinating about Jamaica when it came down to Port Royal. And Henry Morgan basically ran Kingston at the time, Port Royal, prior to the earthquake. And what I didn't know was the pirateers at the time were 100%, or at least Henry Morgan was, against slavery. Jamaica did not have slaves. It was after the earthquake or after Henry Morgan either was hung or anyways, he was out of the picture, where all of a sudden now Jamaica was open for slavery. So the pirates, these people that you think of as criminals that have no morals were the people that were accepting of a multicultural crew. You get the job done. We split, whatever the spoils, and we're all good to go. It's too bad that the world never thought about that at the time. And still, doesn't think about, there's still racism everywhere, but
But the pirates were given license by the state in order to be pirates and to plunder. So I can't give them a pass. I can't give Captain Morgan a pass, I'm afraid. I think it is interpreted.
No, there's no pass, but
what's interesting to me is that slavery was terrible.
Yes,
slavery was traumatic. It was a brutalizing trade, but equally, or maybe not equally, but there was also great trauma on the poor working class in Britain, for instance, at the same time. The poor children going down mines. Okay, they were paid. Slaves weren't paid, but there was great privation. And the only people who really capitalized on slavery were the wealthy people. I don't think the poor British people capitalized on slavery. I mean, there were beneficiaries of the institutions that were built on slavery. I mean, some of the great houses and some of the great institutes we have in this country were built on sugar. But I sometimes see a connection between the impoverished British white people in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century and the enslaved Africans in Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean. But what's kind of clear, I think, and what I really enjoyed about somewhere like Jamaica is that they turn base metal into gold. They turn things around. And when you think about, have you been, by the way, Norm?
Oh, yeah, a few times.
Yeah, well, would you agree with me, Norm, that everyone should go to Jamaica? Because Jamaica is one of the most vibrant places on the planet, and everybody is a star in Jamaica. I wrote a book, as you might know, about the whalers, Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Bunny Wailer. And when I went to research that book, and I would go to Trenchtown, I'd go to some of the areas where these people lived, you'd find versions of Bob Marley on the streets just singing all the time. And there are just so many of them, actually. And I was really intrigued by that idea that there's a kind of a tradition of musicality that is passed on through the generations as well. And I was delighted in the end to be able to track down this man, Bunny Wailer, one of the original Wailers, and in a I suppose backhand way to be able to write about the history of Jamaica through people like Bob Marley and Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer. When you write these sort of books that I write, Norm, they're difficult to write because often the publishers are not very convinced by them because they worry about the commercial prospects of the books. Who's going to buy the things? And even though I've written 5 books, every time I go into the publishers to pitch another idea, it's not a surety. I really wanted to write a book about Jamaica and about the history of slavery and about how the country was forged out of bloodshed, the country was forged out of plunder. But I knew that if I was to go into the publishers and say, this is the book I want to write, they would say, well, don't slam the door on the way out. So I went in a few years ago and I said, I want to write a book about Bob Marley, Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer. And they said, here, sign here. But having got the commission, I was able to then use these 3 men to, in a way, portray the modern history of Jamaica. Because if you were to look at someone like Bob Marley, Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer, you see that they represent 3 ways of being black in the latter half of the 20th century. So Bob Marley was fair-skinned, photogenic, accommodating. Peter Tosh was tall, very black, always wore dark glasses, intimidated people, enjoyed doing that. If you went to see Peter Tosh and he didn't like the question, he might be, peeling an orange with a machete or peeling a mango with a machete, and he started waving the machete in front of you. And Bunny Wailer, a man famously who never really wanted to go on tour, he'd rather plant his crops than go on tour. And there you have 3 versions of black people in Jamaica. You have Bob Marley, the accommodator. He's not going to sell out, he's going to be practical. You have Peter Tosh, the militant man, the rebel man who ends up being murdered in 1987. And you have Bunny Wailer, the man who's in retreat. He'd rather be non-aligned and not attached to anybody. In a way, I was able to write a history book about Jamaica through those 3 men. And it's the most fascinating country, I think, one of the most fascinating countries on the planet, because it's one of the first modern societies in a way, because you had these pirates, you had the planters, you had poor indentured workers, you had people from Africa. Nobody ultimately who lived in that region was from the region, because a lot of the Caribs, a lot of the native Indians were killed. So most of the people who live on those islands are foreign, so they don't belong there. And the Rastas will tell you in song, Jamaica is an island, but not I-land. They don't belong there, they belong elsewhere. And so that sense of a society in flux, a society where everybody feels temporary, is a wonderful society to write about as a case study for the way that we are presently.
What is the name of that book?
My book was called, thank you very much, Norm. Here's the big sell now. My book is called I and I, The Natural Mystics. In North America, the publishers weren't confident about the phrase I and I, so they just shortened it to The Natural Mystics. But as you know, Norm, I and I is what the Rastas say. I and I is me and God. I and I, so God resides in you. It's one of my favorite books, actually. It came with a bit of difficulty, and it cost me something, not just in terms of the sacrifice I had to make in writing the thing. When I got the commission to write the book, I sold it on the idea that I would track down the last remaining of the original whalers. So I said I'd track down Bunny Whaler. He's a bit of a reclusive character. He's also a bit of an obeah man. Do you know about obeah, kind of Jamaican voodoo? So I was tasked with finding Bunny Whaler, and I could never find him. I paid a lot of money to middlemen who said that they knew where he was. They said, oh yeah, man, Bunny's going to be at 6th Street and 7th Avenue in Frenchtown at midnight. He'd be there. Just get yourself down there. But he was never there. And I spent more than a year looking for him. I wrote the book in about 2.5 years, and I actually submitted the manuscript before I'd found him. Huh. But then in the same week of submitting the manuscript, I got a call from one of these fixers, these middlemen, and said, oh, if you want to interview Bunny Whaler, get down to Gatwick Airport. He's arriving in the UK at Gatwick Airport at the beginning of the European tour. So I went there, and I greeted him with a lot of people and his entourage at Gatwick Airport. And he didn't pay much attention to me, and we all had to follow him to his tour bus, which is parked in the garage at Gatwick Airport. And it had sort of tinted glass. I remember I went there with my daughter, who was very attractive, very glamorous and very kind, and the sort of person who would disabuse you of any notion that you constitute a threat to anybody. So I went with her, and she was going to take photographs. And he softened a little bit, but he wouldn't talk to me until he carried the most important act. This is the garage of Gatwick Airport. He opens a suitcase and gets out this huge stash of Ganja, and he rolls the biggest spliff I've ever seen in the world. That's the first thing he must do. We had quite a nice conversation, and I wrote it up, and I included that in the book. And then about 6 months after the book came out, I got this email from someone who was purporting to be Bunny Whaler, and I just thought it was a crank because it's such a weird email. And then I got another email and another. I got about half a dozen emails, and it's clear to me that it was Bunny Whaler, and the emails were rather horrible emails that were threatening me with the fact that I had, in Jamaican parlance, I'd skanked him. I'd somehow robbed him by not remunerating him for the interview that I'd done with him. And he'd been online, or one of his mates had been online, and they'd seen that the book had done reasonably well, and he wanted his share. But he didn't come out clearly and say that. I had to infer that. But each email got more and more violent. And the last email from him, and by now I got my publishers involved because they got a bit scary. But the last email, he reminded me what had happened to Leslie Kong. So Leslie Kong was a producer. The Whalers had several producers in the course of their career. And before they found Chris Blackwell, or he found them at Island Records, before that, there's a man called Leslie Kong. And when the Whalers started to surface, Leslie Kong said he was going to bring out an album called The Best of the Whalers. And Bunny Whaler went to see Leslie Kong and threatened him, said, don't bring out that album, because by now they were no longer represented by him. He said, don't bring out that album. If you do bring out that album, you will not live to reap the rewards of your transgression. And within 3 months, Leslie Kong had a heart attack and died. He's putting this in the email to me. And subsequently, there's a man called Timothy White, you may know, who wrote the first book about Bob Marley called Catch a Fire. And when Bunny Whaler heard about Timothy White's book coming out, he again went to see Timothy White and warned him not to write the book. He gave him the same warning, and within 3 months, Timothy White suffered heart failure and died. And he said, as for Timothy White, as for Leslie Kong, as for you, the binoculars of Jah are on you, he said to me. So he cursed me with an obia threat. And unfortunately, I was due to go to Jamaica soon after the threat arrived, and it's too good an opportunity to pass up. So I did go to Jamaica, but all the time I was there, I was waiting for the threat to be realized and to be murdered. And I remember the day came when it was the first day after 3 months, and I was still alive. I thought, yes, I have outlived the curse. The curse or the threat is now extinct, and I'm probably never going to be in the same position as Timothy White and Leslie Kong.
Thanks for listening, guys and gals. That concludes part 1 of our interview with Colin Grant. Make sure to tune in later in the week to hear the rest of the interview. As always, make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It keeps you up to date with all things I Know This Guy and helps us grow the show. That's enough of me, and I'll see you next time.